Hello, and welcome back to the Argyle CIO Leadership Forum. My name is Brittany Sullivan with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. I have a couple of notes before I turn things over to our speaker. First, a quick reminder to stop by our sponsors' virtual booths at any time during this event and for the following week. Our partners are committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. At any time during today's event, you can visit their virtual booths from the main agenda page, which includes complimentary materials, information, and meet and greet opportunities. To ask questions throughout the session, simply type into the Q&A chat, and we will address your questions at the end of the session. Thank you again for joining us. Now let's get started. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker, Syed Khan, Senior Director of Information Security Tools, Platforms, and Products at Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Illinois, Montana, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas. We are excited to have Syed with us with his closing keynote presentation titled Cybersecurity Watch, Preparing Your Organizations for New Regulations. Welcome, Syed, and over to you.
All right. Thank you, Brittany. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here today. I'm very delighted to discuss with you on how your organization can prepare for new regulations. If you can go to the next slide, please. All right, let me give you an overview of what you're going to hear. So this presentation will take anywhere between 20 to 25 minutes. I will start with some cybersecurity threats and industry trends that are going on right now. I talk about some existing regulations that are in place in pipeline, and some that are in the pipeline, and then move on to cyber attacks and what is known versus unknown. Talk about some good foundational security best practices, and finally wrap up with what should enterprises do to prepare for these new regulations. We will then open up for questions at the end of this presentation. All right, next slide, please. All right, so if you're in IT or in cybersecurity, you already know about the life in the shark-infested cyber world, right? Your mission is to stay ahead of these bad guys and keep your enterprises safe. So this starts with understanding the threats that you face and what kind of methods these threats use and who are they targeting, right? Some of the common threats that you see are very familiar. You have your threat actors or cyber criminals who are hell-bent on making you pay by taking advantage of your weak security protocols or unpatched systems that you have in your enterprise. Then you have your insider threat actors who might be like disgruntled employees or untrained staff who don't know what they're doing with their privilege access, for example. And this would also include your third-party entities who have access to your environment. Then you move on to your state-sponsored actors who are operating on behalf of nation states, primarily to use cyber threat activities to advance their geopolitical objectives. These are the most sophisticated threat actors out there. They have dedicated resources and personnel and extensive planning and coordination. And then you have the last one is the hacktivists who are ideologically motivated to carry out these cyber threat activities and are generally with lower sophistication compared to state-sponsored actors in cyber criminals. So what are some of the cyber trends that we are seeing today, right? So we see an increased use of ransomware attacks that are being targeted against a lot of these companies. We have targeted phishing and social engineering. We have third-party account and network compromises. We have exploitation of deficient security hygiene, like unpatched systems. And finally, we also have easy access to commodity malware, which is readily available malware or programs on the internet, right? And the methods these threat actors are using are through social engineering. They're using weak, stolen, or compromised credentials. We have exposed entry points or endpoints or misconfiguration in the environment, which are being taken advantage of, and missing and poor encryption in your networks as well. And targets, it's across the board. We have health insurers, providers, hospitals. We have government entities, service providers, financial service companies, and critical infrastructure as well. So if you go to the next slide, let's look at some of next slide, please. Yeah, so if you, in the next slide, you'll see some of the regulation acts that we already have in place. So I'm not gonna bore you with all the regulations that already exist today. Most of you would have heard of them. Some of you can identify and relate to them as your organization complies to these regulations, right? So the state of cybersecurity today is very, very critical, especially due to the size and significance of these cyber attacks that are happening. the effects of these events can spread beyond countries and borders, right? And for new regulations, government feels the pressure to do something, and many are considering enacting new rules and laws. So as part of that, what's going on right now is lawmakers are frequently struggling to manage technology since they have to do so because of the political necessity. And most do not have a strong understanding of how technology issue is at the bottom of it, right? So the consequences, the impacts, the uncertainties on companies are often realized until afterward. So for example, what's going on with the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, Department of Transportation, DOE, Department of Energy, and the CISA are all working on new regulations and enforcement in the United States. Moreover, in the 36 states have enacted new cybersecurity legislation in 2021 alone. And many initiatives exist globally, including like China and Russia's data localization requirements, India's CERT and incident reporting requirements, and EU's GDPR and incident reporting. So companies, on the other hand, do not have to sit back and wait for these rules to be written or then implemented. Rather, they should be working now and understand the types of regulation that are being considered and ascertain the uncertainties and potential consequences and prepare to act for these. So next slide. So let's look at some of the cyber attacks that are known versus unknown, right? So the reason I put in the colonial pipeline picture here is because I want to talk about that a little bit. But what I want to cover is that most cybersecurity related regulations have been prioritized privacy over cybersecurity. So for example, what happens is most cybersecurity attacks are not required to be reported. So if private information such as names or credit card numbers is stolen, then the appropriate authorities must be notified. So in case of Colonial Pipeline, there was no personal information that was stored. So Colonial Pipeline was not required to report a ransomware attack at all. That caused it to shut down more than 50% of the East Coast pipelines. So as a result, it is nearly impossible to know how many cyber attacks exist today and what forms do they take. So some reports propose that only 10 to 25% of cybersecurity incidents get reported. And because of this, there is not a way to measure it, and so you cannot manage it well. So governments have determined that this strategy is very, very unsustainable. In the United States, for example, the White House, the Congress, the SEC, and numerous other agencies and local governments are considering or pursuing on how to enforce new rules requiring companies to report cyber incidents, particularly in critical infrastructure industries such as energy, healthcare, communications, financial services. And when these rules get implemented, Colonial Pipeline would be required to report that ransomware attack under these new rules. So let's go to the next slide. So how do we prepare, right? So what we do is we start with foundational security best practices that we have. So for preparing and getting ahead of this, at the foundational level, you need to look at cybersecurity frameworks that are available to build and mature your cybersecurity program. So it could be very confusing to navigate through all the different frameworks that are available today. So Frank Kim, the previous CISO at SANS, so he did a great way of explaining how these frameworks, and he split them into 3 different categories that I've outlined here. So first we start with, we'll start with the control frameworks, but I do want to mention about why these cybersecurity frameworks are very important. These frameworks provide a basis for achieving a strong security posture and preventing data breaches, right? So adopting these frameworks requires a decision that needs time and commitment and resources to get it done. And if it is done right, it's worth it. The framework offers an organized way to become secure and continually measure the effectiveness of how these security controls are established by the framework. All right, so let's go ahead and start with how the control frameworks, let's start with how the control frameworks are built. So the control frameworks are the building blocks of controls that are needed to mitigate any cyber attacks against your system or networks. So in the latest version, which is the Center for Internet Security Controls, the CIS 18 version 8 has 18 controls that exist today. So these are basic so these start from basic things like inventorying your enterprise hardware and software assets, to data protection, to access control, continuous vulnerability management, and pen testing, to name a few. So there are 18 different controls with which you can start putting that together in your company, and you have a maturity scale from basic to managed. So you would be able to deploy this in your environment and be able to measure it. And what this will do is help you develop an essential strategy for your security team to follow these controls, build a baseline set of controls, and then evaluate where your current technical state is, and then start filling in the gaps by prioritizing the control implementation. All right, so once you have the basic foundational controls in place, the control frameworks in place, then we go on to the program frameworks. So then you start building your security program together. So how does that work? So the program frameworks will help you build a security program. And one of the common security programs that we have, security program frameworks that we have or use in the United States is the CSF, which is from NIST. So NIST is National Institute of Standards and Technology. They have the cybersecurity framework. And what is at the core of their framework is a list of cybersecurity functions that follow a basic pattern of cyber defense. So you can identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. So this is the basic pattern in which the whole CSF, the cybersecurity framework, is set up. So this framework provides an organized mechanism for identifying risk and assets that require protection within your enterprise. It lists the ways the organization must protect these assets by detecting risks, responding to threats, and recovering assets in event of a security incident. So this will help you assess the state of your security program. And if you don't have one, it'll help you build a comprehensive program. And then what you can do is you can start measuring it and simplifying it. And it'll also help you simplify the communication between security and business leaders as well. And finally, you have the risk frameworks, which will help you define how to assess and manage your risk. So the risk frameworks will help you identify, measure, quantify the risk, along with helping you structure the program for risk management, so that you can focus on critical risks, and then you can line it up based on the risk profile. And eventually, this will help you prioritize the security activities based on risk management. And what will happen is all this together will help you build a strong framework on how you can run and mature your security program. So if you go to the next slide, please. So what should enterprises be doing now? So enterprises should start with maintaining a good security hygiene. So what does that mean? So maintaining a good security hygiene means making sure that any high-risk software components, such as Java, Flash, or Internet Explorer, that are prone to zero-day attacks are being monitored and are being looked at very closely. And devices that containing this high-risk software are also monitored, and especially the ones that are actively exposed are monitored and alerted. What we then do is we also need to ensure that any misconfigured devices or applications that are present in the entry point for an attacker to exploit, so these applications are monitored, and these device settings are compared and looked at, comparing it to the recommended best practices that can help you identify any misconfiguration in your devices across your network. We also need to look at unencrypted or weakly encrypted network connections and protocols. These will leave your enterprise susceptible to, let's say, man-in-the-middle attacks or anything like that. And additionally, these devices and users that connect to the insecure networks and applications are at risk and can be compromised as well. The last one would be the unpatched vulnerabilities that are easily exploited. And what happens when this, what happens is that this would infect your endpoints or your servers. Although vulnerability management products provide a list of devices that need to be patched, the real challenge is to identify the high-risk devices in your environment that can be easily used or hijacked to launch attacks. So vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure or devices with access to sensitive data present a significant risk to your environment and your enterprise today. So make sure that, so the next one is making sure that your procedures are up to task. What this means is that your companies need to define what materiality is and review their current policies and procedures for determining whether materiality within these new policies applies in light, materiality in light of these new regulations applies to you or not. And they will likely need to revise them and streamline their operations, especially if such decisions must be done frequently and quickly. You need to have your ransomware policies up to date. Regulations are being formulated as we speak in areas such as reporting ransomware attacks and even making it a crime to pay a ransom. So company policies regarding paying ransom need to be reviewed along with likely changes to cyber insurance policies as well. Then you need to be prepared to have a software bill of materials in order to better vet your digital supply chain. A lot of companies did not know that they had Log4j vulnerability in their systems because the software that was often bundled with the software that was often bundled with another software that had it, and it went into a complete mess. So there are regulations that are being proposed that requires companies to maintain a detailed, up-to-date software bill of materials, or SBOM, so that they can quickly and accurately know all the different pieces of software that is embedded within their complex computer systems. Although SBOM is useful for other purposes too, it may require significant changes to the ways the software is developed and acquired in your company. So the impact of these changes need to be reviewed by your management. And what more should you be doing, right? So someone likely in your company should be reviewing these proposed or new regulations that are coming our way. They need to evaluate what impacts they will have on your organization. So these are not just technical details left for IT or security teams to look at. They would have company-wide implications and likely changes to many policies and procedures throughout the organization. So this is something that needs to be looked at not just by IT, but also your legal or your finance organizations to see what impacts that they might have. So to the extent that most of these new regulations will still be malleable, and your organization may want to actively influence what directions these regulations take and how they are implemented or enforced. So that would be the end. And if you go to the next slide, I'm hoping that I hope that this helps you and your companies prepare for new regulations that are coming in. And I'm happy to take any questions that you would have. And I'm hoping that this was a little bit educational as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Syed, for such an insightful presentation. As a reminder, audience members can still enter questions, and we'll go ahead and review a few that came through. This first question asks, how do you stay on top of new regulations and trends specific to the sector you work within?
Sure, that's a great question. So, especially the sector especially if you are in critical infrastructure sector, government, there's a lot of government orders which are coming in, which are helping the companies, especially in the United States. It helps a lot because of the, so it's helping a lot for the government, which is coming out and helping give us all these information about how we need to be prepared for these trends. You see a lot of sectors, for example, you have these frameworks, let's say for healthcare, you have the HIPAA, and what happens is you have these frameworks which are available for free, where these companies can go and look at what kind of regulations are available and what kind of controls they need to put in place to address these regulations.
Great, thank you. This next question asks, how can CISOs be seen as partners and business enablers versus the role who blocks?
Right, so it's a great question, right? So as a security professional, the biggest challenge you have is to convince the business that you're there to enable them and you are not there to stop from what they're doing. So the analogy I give the business to the business is that we are the seatbelts in your car, where when you want to go at the speed that you want to go, we are there to protect you and not to stop you from doing what you're doing. So at the end of the day, it is a business decision at the risk that they need to take. The more it is easy for business It's more easy for the business to understand what are the risks are, and it's easy for security professionals as us to explain it to the business. It becomes easy for businesses to make those decisions. And we are here as security professionals to facilitate those conversations and help them understand the risks that involve in making those decisions for them.
Great, thank you. This next question, do you see IT costs rising as a result of proactive or reactive security hygiene?
So it's a great question. Security costs are going to rise. The reason I say that is because it's a double-edged sword. If you go to your leadership and say that, hey, we are going to have rise in cost because we have to start doing all these things, you need to be able to quantify it with what is the business impact that's going to have if we don't do that, right? So the way I would present it is to your business, first you need to quantify what is the risk that you have within your environment, and you then take it up to your leadership and say that, hey, this is what we need to protect this enterprise or this risk. And then you can use that to say that in case if we have a breach, this is what the impact that's going to cost. So it should be an easy decision for us to be making from a leadership perspective, to be looking at what the impact is, what the cost is, and how is it going to do it. And again, you can also mitigate that risk by going and taking that cyber insurance, and you can have insurance for loss of business. But again, if you're not up and running, your customers are not going to be staying with you. They're going to take their business somewhere else. So you need to be looking at how these small things add up to how your company is running and how they're evaluating the risks to their business.
Thank you, Syed. And looks like we have a few more questions that are coming through. This next question, have you run across any really good matrices that tie frameworks to regulations, ones that might point out gaps between frameworks you follow and the regulatory requirements?
Yeah, so there are quite a few out there, which are like, there are some frameworks which are built specifically for the industry, right? So High Trust is one which is specifically built for let's say the healthcare industry, right? So that is a framework that I look at and say, okay, so if I follow this High Trust framework, I'm HIPAA certified, so that I don't have to follow. I mean, it's not that I don't have to follow, it kind of fills those gaps. So every industry should have some of those frameworks that are available that can be followed as well. The best part about cybersecurity is that a lot of these frameworks are open source, which means that they are continuously looked at and being done. Like, for example, NIST coming out with a cybersecurity framework, it's us, the taxpayers, who have paid for it. So it's already available out there for us to go and consume.
Great. And then how do you structure the IT and security function so that they not only meet and exceed regulations, but they can measure that compliance in a provable way?
So, I mean, it is a collaboration. I don't see IT and security as two different teams. I see it as one team. The reason I say that is because there's been a lot of challenges getting together and understanding who owns what or who's responsible for what. So my thought, so the way I look at teams is that at the end of the day, we all are the same team working for the same organization. So we all need to come together and look at how are we solving these problems, how are we measuring, or how are we evaluating the risk that exists in our environment, and how are we quickly identifying that and patching it, or whatever is need to be done to get ahead of that risk.
Wonderful, thank you. And we have a couple more questions, a little bit more time to answer these.
Sure.
How do you balance the disclosure of a hack to help others prepare without drawing attention to your organization by admitting that you were hacked?
So, I mean, I'm a very ethical person. So if there is a hack that is going to happen, or that's happened, you need to be more proactive in communicating it rather than being reactive. Of course, you need to involve your leadership with regards to privacy and your communication teams. So they might have So the best part is you need to start working on doing those things right now and saying that how do you prepare and communicate if there is going to be an attack or a hack. So you need to be doing those things, having those communications prepared, working with your privacy team, working with your communications team, and having all those playbooks in place so that in case, God forbid, you are hacked or you are attacked, you are able to go and follow that playbook and be able to communicate in a way you do it. But again, it is better to be proactive and go and communicate ahead of time rather than being reactive and not communicating.
Thank you. And while it's never possible to entirely predict future regulations, how do you identify areas likely to face increased scrutiny or of increased risk for additional governmental control?
So it's a good question. So if you look at what's going on, especially with the critical infrastructure areas, so a lot of these critical infrastructure which is going to have wider impact are the areas which are going to be scrutinized. So there is going to be a lot of these regulations which might be available for the government right now, which might slowly start coming over towards the private sector. For example, based on FISMA, which is for federal industries to be able to have an authorization to operate. So those are certifications that these applications have to take at least once or twice. I mean, once every 2 years or 3 years. So I see some of those things cascading down to private sector where there is going to be some of regulations that are coming in with regards to how these sectors are going to, or how these private industries are going to report incidents. And also in the case of privacy versus cybersecurity incidents, a lot of these incidents that were reported back were related to privacy and not cybersecurity. But now those regulations are being changed where in case if you have attacks or if you're being ransomware, you have to report that back as part of incident management. So those are the changes I see coming across where the new regulations are changing.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And it looks like we have time for one last question.
Sure.
Can you share what the best legal and public relations strategies are to have in place prior to enactment of new and/or updated regulations?
So the best part is to have a proactive communication with your team, your legal team, your privacy team, your communications team, make sure that everyone understands what their roles are, and also go through tabletop exercises and making sure that in case if we are breached, these are the steps we would follow, or if there is a regulation, this is how we would react. So having those playbooks, having those tabletop exercises across these different teams would help any company be better prepared, not just for regulations, but also for any kind of breaches that they might have. So being proactive and having those lines of communication open across the organization would help a whole lot.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much again, Syed, for such an insightful keynote presentation. I also want to thank everyone who joined us today. This session, along with all of today's content, will be made available on demand following the event. This does officially conclude the Argyle CIO Leadership Forum. So thank you again for joining us and engaging in our content. Have a great rest of your day and happy holidays.